So, so the point is that if you encrypt one character at a time, then each character, let's say in English, is going to always get encrypted into the same character, which means that by doing a frequency analysis, I'll be able to find out, I'll be able to reason about what characters are most frequently used, and most of you probably know that the character E is what is used most often in English. So if I do an analysis and find out what encrypted character appears most often, then I'll be able to immediately figure out that is the one that's being mapped into E, and then I can then go on to analyze the next most frequent character, or else I can start looking at pairs of characters and then say which two characters occur together. So I can use that statistical information to disambiguate further and so on, and before you know it, I'll be able to decrypt the whole message without knowing anything about the key. And so this is why you have to essentially make the search space for this kind of analysis to be too big. So if I make this, if I want on 128-bit blocks, right? So if I operate on characters, then often I'm working with a search space that maps, say, is a 6-bit character to another 6-bit character, right? So if I look at all the possible functions that map 6-bit characters to 6-bit characters, there isn't a whole lot. Okay. In particular, I'm not even looking at. Whereas if I look at mapping functions that are mapping 128-bit characters to 128-bit blocks, shouldn't say characters, right? So then that becomes a much this is a very, very large space as compared to this, and as a result, any kind of analysis on this space becomes computationally infeasible. And so this is why we use block ciphers that operate on large blocks, and this is also the reason why I said that modern block ciphers typically choose 128 bits rather than 64 bits, because 64 bits is, although it is large, it is still, may not be very large enough for certain types of attacks. So, so the conventional technique is that you start from a block cipher and then you derive stream ciphers from that, and there are several ways to do this. I'm not going to talk about this here, but you can easily look up this topic if you are interested. Okay. So before we finish up, let's try to understand a little bit about the structure of a typical symmetric key cryptography algorithm. So again, we need to produce a reversible mapping, right? Because we want to encrypt and then we want to retrieve the message by decryption. So we need an invertible function. Okay. So and the techniques for developing good encryption functions, they were developed by Shannon, Claude Shannon, who's considered the father of information theory, and with his most famous work having taken place in 1948. Okay, so this is the really very old and very well established techniques. So diffusion and confusion are are terms that don't have a very technical definition, but you can understand them intuitively as follows. Diffusion means that somehow the bit patterns in the plain text are somehow dispersed, right? And confusion means you kind of mix up. So you take bits from different parts and permute them and mix them up, right? And by doing these operations repeatedly, you tend to produce ciphertext from plain text such that the ciphertext looks nothing like plain text, and it's very hard to do any kind of statistical analysis to find out what could be the correspondence between plain text blocks and ciphertext blocks. Okay. So so this kind of a typical symmetric key cryptography uses these diffusion and confusion operations, but it uses them in many types. So these are called rounds. So often you may have like 32 rounds of these operations, and in each round what may typically happen is that you may take the entire plain text block, divide it into two halves, and then one half goes through as it is, the other half is permuted using the key. Okay, and you can see that there are K1 through Kn, and these are all derived from the input key K, right? So that each round has its own version of the key that's derived from the original key, and in each phase you do this permutation based on the key, and then the other half goes through, and then you flip it around so that the side the half that gets permuted in one round is going through without any change in the next round, and so on. You don't really need to understand anything a whole lot of detail over here, but the main point I want to convey is that essentially you have to go through many rounds of this kind of simple permutation in order to achieve your final answer. Okay. There are many symmetric key cryptography algorithms. DES is one of the oldest ones. It was developed in the 1970s or maybe late 60s, and then there have been several other algorithms like Blowfish and RC2 and RC5 that have been developed mostly for software use, whereas DES was considered mostly for hardware use. And then AES is the most commonly used algorithm now, and it is an algorithm that was designed to be efficient in hardware as well as software, right? And so this is the one that's most commonly being used today. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about symmetric key cryptography.